The sun had barely crested the eastern horizon when Pearl Lawson stepped off the stagecoach in Lincoln, Nebraska, her small carpetbag clutched tightly to her chest like a shield. The year was 1876, and the bustling frontier town represented her last hope for a new beginning. Pearl's lips remained firmly closed as the driver handed down her single trunk, her eyes conveying the thanks she could not speak aloud. The dust from the departing stagecoach had barely settled when Pearl felt the familiar weight of stairs upon her slender shoulders. She had grown accustomed to the curious glances, the whispered conversations that trailed in her wake. At 22, Pearl had not spoken a word in over 4 years, not since the night her family's farmhouse had burned to the ground with her parents trapped inside. The doctors called it shock. The townsfolk back in Missouri called it peculiar. Most suitors called it reason enough to look elsewhere. Pearl straightened her simple blue dress and adjusted her bonnet, steeling herself for what lay ahead. Her cousin Martha had written that Lincoln was different a place where Pearl might find work despite her peculiarity. The letter tucked inside her pocket promised a room at the boarding house and a possible position at the local mercantile. If only Pearl could convince the owner of her capability, despite her silence. The morning heat was already building as Pearl made her way down the main street, her eyes taking in the wooden storefronts, the horses tied at hitching posts, and the people hurrying about their business. Lincoln was larger than she had expected, with signs of prosperity evident in the newly painted buildings and the steady stream of commerce. As Pearl approached the mercantile, she paused, gathering her courage. The bell above the door jingled cheerfully as she entered, a stark contrast to the immediate hush that fell over the shop's occupants. An older woman behind the counter looked up, her sharp eyes assessing Pearl with practiced efficiency. "May I help you?" The woman asked, her tone neither warm nor cold. Pearl reached into her pocket and withdrew the letter, offering it to the woman with a hopeful expression. The woman, Mrs. Abernathy, according to Martha's description, took the letter with visible reluctance, her lips pursed as she read. "So you're Martha's cousin," Mrs. Abernathy said finally. "She wrote about you, said you were different." She folded the letter and handed it back. "I'll be plain with you, Miss Lawson. I need someone who can call out prices, haggle with suppliers, and chat with customers. A silent shop girl won't do. I'm sorry you've come all this way for nothing." Pearl felt her cheeks burn with humiliation as several customers turned to stare openly now. She had expected this response, had steeled herself for it, yet the sting was no less painful. With a small nod of understanding, Pearl turned to leave, her eyes fixed firmly on the wooden floorboards. "Wait a minute now, Mrs. Abernathy," a deep voice interrupted from the back of the store. "I reckon you're being hasty." Pearl looked up to see a tall figure stepping forward from between shelves stacked with dry goods. The man wore the dust of the trail on his clothes, but there was nothing common about the way he moved, confident and purposeful. His dark hair curled slightly beneath the brim of his Stetson, and his blue eyes held Pearl's gaze without wavering. "Isaiah Eaton," Mrs. Abernathy said with obvious respect. "Didn't see you there. Just explaining to this young woman that I need someone who can speak to work here." Isaiah Eaton tipped his hat slightly toward Pearl, his eyes never leaving her face. "Madam," he acknowledged with a slight nod before turning back to Mrs. Abernathy. "Mrs. Abernathy, I've watched this young lady since she walked in. She carries herself with dignity. Her clothes are modest but clean and well mended. Her eyes are sharp and miss nothing. Those are qualities worth more than idle chatter any day." Mrs. Abernathy folded her arms across her ample bosom. "Be that as it may, Mr. Eaton, practical considerations. She can write, can't she?" Isaiah asked, directing the question to Pearl. Pearl nodded quickly, reaching again into her pocket to produce a small slate and chalk she carried for just such occasions. "There you have it," Isaiah said, smiling now. "And I'd wager she's a quick study with numbers too." Pearl wrote rapidly on her slate and held it up. "I was teaching arithmetic before the fire." Something flickered in Isaiah's eyes, understanding, perhaps, or recognition of a kindred spirit who knew what it meant to lose everything. He turned back to Mrs. Abernathy. "Give her a chance. 1 week. If she can't do the job, I'll personally find her other employment." Mrs. Abernathy's eyebrows rose. "You're mighty invested in a stranger, Mr. Eaton." Isaiah shrugged, his shoulders moving beneath his trail-worn coat. "I know what it's like to be judged too quickly." He smiled again, a gentle expression that transformed his weathered face. "Besides, some of the best conversations I've ever had didn't involve a single word. Sometimes, Mrs. Abernathy, a person's presence says everything." Pearl felt a curious warmth spread through her chest at his words. She had become so accustomed to her silence being viewed as a deficiency, a failing that rendered her somehow less than whole. Yet this stranger, this cowboy, had seen something else entirely. "Well," Mrs. Abernathy said finally, her resolve clearly weakening, "I suppose 1 week wouldn't hurt." "Martha did speak highly of your character, Miss Lawson." Isaiah touched the brim of his hat again. "Much obliged, Mrs. Abernathy. You won't regret it." To Pearl he added, "Welcome to Lincoln, Miss Lawson. I have a feeling you'll find your place here." With that, he purchased his supplies and left the store, the bell jingling behind him. Pearl watched him go, 1,000 unspoken words caught in her throat. Mrs. Abernathy's voice pulled her back to the present. "Well, don't just stand there, girl. Put your things away and get back here. If Isaiah Eaton vouches for you, that's good enough for me. But mind, 1 week is all I'm promising." Pearl nodded gratefully, her heart lighter than it had been in years. She didn't know why a stranger had championed her cause, or whether she would ever see him again. But for the first time since the fire, she felt the faintest stirring of hope. The boarding house proved to be a modest 2-story structure on a side street, run by Martha's friend, Mrs. Holloway, a widow with shrewd eyes but a kind smile. Pearl's room was small but clean, with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a window that overlooked the burgeoning town. "Your cousin wrote that you don't speak," Mrs. Holloway said as she showed Pearl to her quarters. "That won't be a problem here, so long as you pay your rent on time and abide by the house rules. No men in the rooms, no coming home after dark without prior arrangement, and Sunday church attendance is expected. Can you manage that?" Pearl nodded, writing on her slate, "Thank you for your kindness." Mrs. Holloway's expression softened slightly. "Well, we've all got our burdens to bear in this life. Supper's at 6 sharp. Don't be late, or you'll go hungry till breakfast." The first few days at the Mercantile proved challenging but not impossible. Pearl worked diligently, learning the inventory and prices with remarkable speed. She carried her slate everywhere, writing brief, polite responses to customer inquiries. Some found her silence off-putting, but others seemed to appreciate her efficient service and the way she listened without interruption. Mrs. Abernathy, initially skeptical, grudgingly admitted that Pearl had a good head for numbers and an even better eye for organization. By the 4th day, she had Pearl tallying the accounts and reorganizing the cluttered storeroom. "I suppose Isaiah was right about you," Mrs. Abernathy remarked one evening as they closed shop. "You've got a way about you, even without words." Pearl smiled her thanks, her thoughts drifting to the cowboy who had spoken up for her that first day. She hadn't seen him since, though she found herself looking up hopefully whenever the bell above the door chimed. On the 5th day, as Pearl was arranging a display of calico fabric, The bell jingled, and Isaiah Eaton walked in. He looked different today, freshly shaved, his dark hair damp from a recent bath, his clothes clean though still worn from trail life. His eyes found Pearl immediately, and a smile spread across his face. "Miss Lawson," he greeted, removing his hat. "I see Mrs. Abernathy had the good sense to keep you on." Pearl smiled and nodded, suddenly self-conscious of her silence in a way she hadn't been in some time. She reached for her slate, wrote quickly, and held it up. "Thank you for your help. I am grateful." Isaiah read her words, his expression thoughtful. "No need for gratitude. I just spoke the truth as I saw it." He glanced around the store, which was empty save for Mrs. Abernathy at the back, taking inventory. "I was wondering if you might join me for supper at the hotel restaurant this evening. I'm in town for a few more days before heading back to my ranch, and I'd enjoy the company." Pearl's eyes widened in surprise. It had been years since anyone had invited her to dine, years since anyone had shown interest in spending time with her by choice rather than obligation. She hesitated, uncertain. Isaiah seemed to read her thoughts. "I understand if you'd rather not." A lady can't be too careful about accepting invitations from men she hardly knows. He smiled again, that same gentle smile that transformed his weathered face. "But I thought perhaps we might get to know each other better. I find I'm curious about the woman behind those expressive eyes." Pearl felt a blush creep up her neck. She quickly wrote, "I would like that, but I must be back at my boarding house by dark. Mrs. Holloway's rules." Isaiah nodded. "I'll have you home well before then, with Mrs. Holloway's approval. Shall I call for you at the Mercantile when you finish work?" "Around 5, Pearl nodded, her heart fluttering with an emotion she'd nearly forgotten anticipation. "Until then," Isaiah said, placing his hat back on his head and touching the brim in a gesture of respect before turning to conduct his business with Mrs. Abernathy. Pearl returned to her work, aware of his presence at the counter, the deep timbre of his voice as he discussed an order of supplies for his ranch. She learned that his property lay some 20 miles outside of Lincoln, that he raised cattle primarily, but was diversifying into horses, and that he commanded significant respect from Mrs. Abernathy, who was not easily impressed. When Isaiah left, promising to return at 5, Mrs. Abernathy approached Pearl with an unreadable expression. "Isaiah Eaton is a good man," she said finally. "One of the best in these parts, but he carries his own burdens, girl, just so you know." Pearl tilted her head questioningly. Mrs. Abernathy sighed. "Not my story to tell." "Just be careful with your heart. Silent or not, it can still break." The warning lingered in Pearl's mind as she finished her shift, but it couldn't dampen her excitement entirely. At 5 o'clock precisely, Isaiah returned, dressed in the same clean clothes but with a leather vest added and his boots polished to a shine. "Ready?" he asked, offering his arm. Pearl nodded, accepting his arm after a moment's hesitation. The contact, though proper and modest, sent a small thrill through her. It had been so long since she'd been touched with gentleness. The hotel restaurant was the finest establishment in Lincoln, with white tablecloths and real glass windows. Several diners looked up as they entered, curiosity in their gazes. Pearl felt the familiar discomfort of being the object of attention but found it easier to bear with Isaiah beside her. Once they were seated, Isaiah handed her a menu. "Order whatever you'd like," he said. "The steak here is particularly good." Pearl studied the offerings, then wrote on her slate, "Steak sounds wonderful. Thank you." When the waiter arrived, Isaiah ordered for both of them without hesitation or condescension, as if accommodating her silence was the most natural thing in the world. "I hope you don't mind me asking," he said once they were alone again, "but have you always been unable to speak?" Pearl shook her head and wrote, "Since the fire that took my parents 4 years ago. The doctors say there is nothing physically wrong." My voice simply stopped. Isaiah nodded slowly. "Grief does strange things to us all. Some shout their pain to the heavens, others turn inward." He paused, his blue eyes studying her face. "I lost my wife and son to smallpox 6 years back. For nearly a year after, I couldn't bear to be around people at all. Holed up in my cabin, barely spoke, barely ate. My foreman finally dragged me out, told me I could die if I wanted, but I'd have to do it under the open sky where God could see me properly." Pearl's eyes filled with tears at his story, at the matter-of-fact way he delivered such profound loss. She wrote, "I am so sorry." "As am I for your losses," Isaiah replied, "but I've come to believe that while grief changes us, it needn't define us forever." He leaned forward slightly. "Your silence doesn't make you less Pearl Lawson. In fact, I find it makes me listen more carefully to what you are saying in other ways." Pearl blinked rapidly, touched by his words and the casual use of her first name. She wrote, "Most people find it unsettling." Isaiah shrugged. "Most people prefer the comfort of idle chatter to the challenge of true communication." He smiled. "Besides, I've spent enough time alone on the range to appreciate the value of comfortable silence." Their meal arrived, and Pearl discovered that eating with Isaiah was surprisingly easy. He carried the conversation effortlessly, telling her about his ranch, his herd of Herefords, and his plans to expand his horse breeding operation. He asked her questions that required only simple answers she could provide with nods or quick notes, never making her feel pressured or pitied. By the time they finished dessert apple pie with fresh cream, Pearl felt more relaxed in another person's company than she had in years. As promised, Isaiah escorted her back to the boarding house well before dark, Mrs. Holloway's approving gaze following them from the window. "I'd like to see you again before I head back to the ranch," Isaiah said as they stood on the front porch. "Perhaps a picnic by the creek on Sunday after church," Pearl nodded, writing, "I would like that very much." Then it's settled. He touched her hand briefly, the contact sending warmth up her arm. "Good night, Pearl. Sleep well." As Pearl prepared for bed that night, she found herself humming softly a sound she hadn't made in years. The tune died in her throat when she realized what she was doing, but the feeling behind it remained. For the first time in a very long time, Pearl Lawson felt truly seen. Sunday dawned clear and warm, a perfect day for a picnic. Pearl attended church with Mrs. Holloway and the other boarders, her gaze constantly drifting to the entrance in hopes of seeing Isaiah. He arrived just as the service was beginning, slipping quietly into a pew near the back. Their eyes met briefly across the crowded room, and he nodded slightly, a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. After the service, Isaiah approached her outside the church, hat in hand, looking handsome in his Sunday best. "Still up for that picnic?" he asked. Pearl nodded enthusiastically, gesturing that she needed to change first. Isaiah agreed to meet her at the boarding house in an hour, giving her time to trade her church dress for a simpler outfit more suitable for sitting on grass. When she emerged from the boarding house in a light blue cotton dress, her hair loosely braided and hanging over one shoulder, Isaiah's appreciative gaze made her cheeks warm. "You look lovely," he said simply, offering his arm. "I've got a horse and buggy waiting. The creek's about a mile outside town, quiet spot where we won't be disturbed." Pearl accepted his arm, noting the picnic basket already loaded in the buggy. She pointed to it questioningly. "Mrs. Henderson at the hotel prepared it," Isaiah explained as he helped her up into the seat. "She owes me a favor after I helped her son out of a tight spot last year." The drive to the creek was pleasant, the summer breeze cooling them as the buggy rolled through the grasslands surrounding Lincoln. Isaiah pointed out landmarks and shared stories about the area, clearly familiar with every hill and valley. "My ranch is that way," he said, gesturing to the northwest. "Eaton's Crossing, I call it. There's a natural ford over the river that cuts through the property. Good water, good grass. I was lucky to claim it when I did, back in '68. Pearl listened attentively, enjoying the cadence of his voice and the evident pride he took in his land. When they reached the creek, Isaiah helped her down from the buggy, his hands strong and sure at her waist. He tethered the horse to a tree where it could graze comfortably, then spread a blanket in the shade of a large cottonwood. The picnic was simple but delicious: cold chicken, corn bread, pickles, and a jar of lemonade. They ate in companionable silence for a while, the sound of the creek and birdsong filling the air. "I've been thinking about what you wrote the other night," Isaiah said eventually, "about your voice stopping after the fire." He looked at her with genuine curiosity, not pity. "Do you ever miss speaking?" Pearl considered the question, then reached for her slate. "Sometimes, but I've grown accustomed to the quiet. Words can be careless, cruel. Silence is safer." Isaiah nodded slowly. "I understand that. After Caroline and James died, words seemed inadequate anyway." "What could I possibly say that would matter?" Pearl wrote again. "Exactly, but people expect words, even empty ones." "Not from me," Isaiah said quietly. "I don't expect words from you, Pearl, just honesty." They sat in silence for a while longer, the intimacy of shared understanding growing between them. When Isaiah finally spoke again, his voice was thoughtful. "I head back to the ranch tomorrow. There's work that can't wait: calves to brand, fences to mend." He hesitated. "Would you allow me to write to you, and perhaps visit when I come to town for supplies?" Pearl's heart quickened at the idea of letters, of continued connection. She wrote, "I would like that very much." Isaiah's smile was like sunrise breaking across the plains. "Good, that's good." He leaned back on his elbows, looking up at the cottonwood branches. "You know, I didn't plan to stay in Lincoln as long as I did this trip. My foreman, Charlie, is probably wondering if I've been waylaid by bandits." Pearl raised an eyebrow questioningly. Isaiah chuckled. "I stayed because of you, Pearl Lawson. I wanted to know the woman with the silent strength I glimpsed that first day in the mercantile." Pearl felt a blush creep up her neck again. She wrote carefully, "And what have you learned?" Isaiah sat up, his blue eyes serious now. "That silence can speak volumes when paired with intelligence and kindness. That some people don't need words to communicate what matters." He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and took her hand. "That I'd like to know you better if you'll allow it." Pearl's heart thundered in her chest as she nodded, unable to look away from his earnest gaze. For a moment she thought he might kiss her, but instead he simply squeezed her hand gently before releasing it. "We should head back," he said, regret evident in his voice. "I promised Mrs. Holloway I'd have you home well before dark." As they packed up the picnic and drove back toward town, Pearl felt a curious mixture of contentment and anticipation. Something was beginning between them, something unexpected and promising. Whether it would lead to more remained to be seen, but for now, it was enough to know that someone saw beyond her silence to the woman beneath. Isaiah's first letter arrived a week after his departure, delivered to the mercantile by a ranch hand passing through Lincoln. Pearl's hands trembled slightly as she broke the seal, aware of Mrs. Abernathy's curious gaze. "Go on and read it," Mrs. Abernathy said gruffly. "I can mind the store for a few minutes." Pearl retreated to the storeroom, settling on a crate to unfold the letter. Isaiah's handwriting was surprisingly neat for a cowboy, the lines evenly spaced across the page. "Dear Pearl," he had written, "I hope this letter finds you well. The ranch is as I left it, though Charlie claims the cattle missed me terribly. I suspect he means he's tired of making all the decisions himself. Spring roundup keeps us busy from dawn till dusk, but I find my thoughts drifting to Lincoln, or more specifically, to you in quiet moments. I've been thinking about our conversation by the creek. You wrote that silence is safer than words, and perhaps that's true. But I've come to believe that safety isn't always what the heart needs most. Sometimes it needs risk, vulnerability, truth, even when those things might hurt. I risk honesty now by telling you that your company affected me deeply. I haven't felt such ease with another person since Caroline died. That both gladdens and frightens me, as I suspect you can understand. I'll be in Lincoln again in 3 weeks' time. Until then, know that you are in my thoughts. Respectfully yours, Isaiah. Pearl pressed the letter to her chest, a smile spreading across her face. That night, she wrote her reply by lamplight in her boarding house room, carefully choosing each word. "Dear Isaiah," she wrote, "your letter brought sunshine to an otherwise ordinary day. Mrs. Abernathy has kept me busy reorganizing the entire mercantile, but I find I enjoy the work. The customers have grown accustomed to my slate, and some even seem to prefer my written answers to the usual chatter. You wrote of safety versus risk. For 4 years, I have chosen safety, the comfort of silence, the protection of isolation. But safety has its price. In protecting myself from potential hurt, I've also walled myself off from potential joy. Meeting you has reminded me that connections, however frightening, are what make life worth living. I too find myself thinking of our afternoon by the creek and looking forward to your return to Lincoln. Until then, I remain yours in friendship, Pearl." She sealed the letter carefully and gave it to Mrs. Abernathy the next day to deliver to the next ranch hand heading in Isaiah's direction. Thus began a correspondence that sustained them both through the weeks of separation. Isaiah's letters painted vivid pictures of ranch life, the satisfaction of watching calves grow strong, the challenge of breaking new horses, the simple pleasure of a meal shared with his ranch hands after a hard day's work. Pearl wrote of her growing confidence at the mercantile, her friendship with young Abigail, another boarder at Mrs. Holloway's, and her tentative ventures into Lincoln's social life, always accompanied by her trusty slate. With each exchange, the connection between them deepened, transcending the limitations of her silence and the distance between them. By the time 3 weeks had passed, Pearl found herself watching the mercantile door with increasing anticipation, her heart leaping at every jingle of the bell. When Isaiah finally appeared, dusty from the trail but grinning broadly at the sight of her, Pearl couldn't help the smile that spread across her own face. "Miss Lawson," he greeted formally, mindful of Mrs. Abernathy's presence. "A pleasure to see you again." Pearl curtsied slightly, her eyes conveying what propriety prevented her from expressing more directly. She wrote on her slate, "Welcome back to Lincoln, Mr. Eaton." Mrs. Abernathy snorted from behind the counter. "Oh, for heaven's sake, you two! I'm not blind." "Isaiah, stop standing there like a fence post and ask the girl to supper properly." Isaiah's cheeks colored slightly, but his smile only widened. "Pearl, would you do me the honor of joining me for supper this evening?" Pearl nodded, writing, "I would be delighted." "Well, that's settled, Mrs. Abernathy declared. "Now, Isaiah, what supplies do you need? Pearl, those bolts of calico won't arrange themselves." They parted reluctantly to attend to business, but not before Isaiah whispered, 5 o'clock. Pearl nodded again, a pleasant anticipation building in her chest as she returned to her work. Supper that evening felt like a continuation of their letters, comfortable, honest, increasingly intimate in the sharing of thoughts if not physical touch. Isaiah spoke of his hopes for the ranch, his dream of building a larger house someday to replace the modest cabin he currently occupied. It was enough for a bachelor, he explained, but lately I've been thinking it might be nice to have a proper home again. Pearl wrote, "What would this proper home include?" Isaiah's expression grew thoughtful. A large kitchen with windows facing east to catch the morning light, a wide porch where one could sit and watch the sunset, bedrooms upstairs with dormer windows. He paused, something vulnerable crossing his face. Room to grow, I suppose. The implications of his words hung between them, unspoken but understood. Pearl felt her cheeks warm as she wrote, "It sounds lovely. It's just a dream for now," Isaiah said, recovering his composure. "But a man needs dreams to work toward." As they finished their meal, Isaiah hesitated, then said, "I'll be in town for 3 days this trip. I was hoping. That is, I wondered if you might show me your favorite places in Lincoln tomorrow, if Mrs. Abernathy can spare you." Pearl wrote, "She owes me a half-day. I would enjoy that very much." Isaiah's smile was reward enough for her boldness. The next day dawned bright and clear, perfect for exploring Lincoln on foot. Pearl met Isaiah outside the Mercantile at noon, having secured Mrs. Abernathy's grudging permission to take the afternoon off. "Where to first?" Isaiah asked, offering his arm. Pearl led him through her Lincoln, the small lending library where she borrowed books, the bakery that made the best apple tarts in Nebraska, the milliner's shop where she admired hats she couldn't afford, and finally, the little park where she sometimes sat during her lunch hour, enjoying the shade of the oak trees. They settled on a bench, watching children play nearby while enjoying the tarts Pearl had insisted on purchasing. "You've made a real life for yourself here," Isaiah observed. "In just a few weeks," Pearl wrote, "Lincoln has been kinder than I expected, or perhaps I've grown braver." "Both, I think," Isaiah said, brushing a crumb from his vest. He seemed to be gathering his courage for something, his usual confidence momentarily dimmed. "Pearl, I know we've only known each other a short time, but I find myself thinking of you constantly. Your letters. They've become the brightest part of my weeks." Pearl's heart quickened as she wrote, "As yours have become for me." Isaiah took a deep breath. "I'd like to court you properly, if you're willing, with letters when I'm at the ranch, visits when I'm in town." He met her gaze directly. "I want to be clear about my intentions. I'm not looking for a casual dalliance. I'm too old for games, and you deserve better than uncertainty." Pearl's hand trembled slightly as she wrote, "Are you certain?" "My silence." Isaiah gently took the slate from her hands before she could finish. "Your silence is part of who you are right now. It doesn't diminish you in my eyes. In fact, it's taught me to listen more carefully, to pay attention to what matters." He returned the slate to her. "I'm not asking for promises, just permission to see where this might lead." Pearl took a moment to collect her thoughts, then wrote firmly, "Yes, I would like that very much." The smile that transformed Isaiah's face was worth any risk her heart might face. He took her hand, raised it to his lips, and pressed a gentle kiss to her knuckles. "Thank you," he said simply. The courtship that followed unfolded like the prairie spring, gradually at first, then with increasing vibrancy and life. Isaiah's visits to Lincoln became more frequent, his letters longer and more revealing. Pearl found herself sharing thoughts on her slate that she had never expressed to anyone, not even in the privacy of her own mind. They developed rituals, picnics by the creek when weather permitted, walks through town on Sunday afternoons, suppers at the hotel where the staff grew accustomed to Pearl's written orders. Mrs. Abernathy watched their growing attachment with a mixture of approval and concern, while Mrs. Holloway relaxed her strict rules enough to allow Isaiah to sit with Pearl on the boarding house porch until the stars emerged. It was on one such evening in late August, 3 months into their courtship, that Isaiah broached a subject they had both been circling. "Harvest will be coming soon," he said, his voice low to avoid disturbing the other boarders who sat further down the porch. "After that, winter sets in fast in these parts." Pearl nodded, wondering where he was leading. "Travel between the ranch and town gets difficult with snow," Isaiah continued. "I've been thinking. That is, I've been wanting to ask." He trailed off, uncharacteristically uncertain. Pearl touched his arm gently, encouraging him to continue. Isaiah took a deep breath. "Pearl, would you consider visiting the ranch before winter? You could stay with Charlie and his wife, Eliza. They have the foreman's house. It would be completely proper." He rushed on before she could respond. "I just want you to see the place, to know what my life is like there before." He didn't finish the thought, but Pearl understood. Before their relationship progressed further, he wanted her to see the reality of ranch life, to know what she might be choosing. She wrote carefully, "I would love to visit." "When?" The relief on Isaiah's face was palpable. The last week of September would be good, after the mercantile's monthly inventory, but before harvest begins in earnest. He hesitated again. "There's something else I should tell you. I've invited your cousin Martha and her husband to visit at the same time. I wrote to them last month." Pearl's eyes widened in surprise. "I hope you don't mind," Isaiah said quickly. "I wanted to do things properly, to have family present, and I thought it might make you more comfortable to have Martha there." Pearl felt a rush of affection for this man who thought so carefully about her comfort and reputation. She wrote, "It was thoughtful of you, thank you." Isaiah relaxed visibly. "So it's settled, you'll come." Pearl nodded, excitement bubbling up inside her at the thought of seeing Isaiah's ranch, of understanding more fully the life he led away from Lincoln. The weeks leading up to the visit passed in a flurry of preparation. Pearl purchased fabric for a new dress, saved every penny for appropriate gifts for her hosts, and tried to quell the butterflies that seemed to have taken up permanent residence in her stomach. Martha's response to Isaiah's invitation arrived in enthusiastic acceptance and warm wishes for Pearl. "I always knew you would find your way," Martha wrote. "Mother's intuition tells me this Isaiah Eaton is a good man. I look forward to meeting him and to seeing you again after so long." The day of departure arrived clear and cool, the first hints of autumn coloring the trees around Lincoln. Isaiah arrived in a wagon rather than the usual buggy, explaining that the journey was too long for a lighter vehicle. Pearl's small trunk was loaded. Goodbyes were said to Mrs. Abernathy and Mrs. Holloway, and they set off toward Eaton's Crossing just as the sun cleared the eastern horizon. "It's about 5 hours' drive," Isaiah explained as they left the town behind. "We should arrive well before Martha and Edward, who are coming from the east." The journey gave Pearl ample opportunity to appreciate the Nebraska landscape, rolling prairies, stretching to the horizon, occasional stands of trees marking the courses of streams and rivers, hawks circling lazily overhead. Isaiah pointed out landmarks, shared stories of his early days in the territory, and generally kept her entertained throughout the trip. Around midday, they crested a gentle rise, and Isaiah reined in the horses. "There it is," he said softly. "Eaton's Crossing." Pearl's breath caught as she took in the view. The ranch spread out below them, a cluster of buildings nestled in a valley where 2 creeks joined to form a small river. Cattle grazed on the surrounding hillsides, and in a fenced pasture near the main house, several horses raised their heads to watch the approaching wagon. "It's not the biggest spread in the territory," Isaiah said, a hint of uncertainty in his voice. "But the land is good, and there's room to expand." Pearl squeezed his arm reassuringly and wrote, "It's beautiful." The tension left Isaiah's shoulders as he flicked the reins to start the horses moving again. "Let me show you the rest." As they approached, Pearl could make out more details: a substantial log cabin that must be the main house, a large barn, bunkhouse, smokehouse, and what appeared to be a foreman's residence set slightly apart from the other buildings. Everything was neat and well maintained, evidence of Isaiah's care for his property. A tall man with graying hair emerged from the barn as they drove into the yard, followed by a robust woman wiping her hands on an apron. Charlie and Eliza Johnson, Pearl surmised correctly. "Welcome back, boss," Charlie called. "Started to think you'd decided to take up permanent residence in Lincoln." Isaiah laughed as he set the brake and jumped down to help Pearl from the wagon. "Had important business there, as you can see." He turned to Pearl with evident pride. "Pearl Lawson, this is Charlie Johnson, the best foreman in Nebraska, and his wife Eliza, whose cooking will make you forget every meal you've ever had before." Pearl curtsied slightly, smiling at the couple who would be her hosts. "Isaiah's told us about your situation," Eliza said kindly. "No need to worry about that here. Between Charlie's endless talking and my fussing, you'll hardly get a word in anyway." The warmth of their welcome eased Pearl's nervousness. While Isaiah and Charlie unloaded her trunk and took it to the foreman's house, Eliza linked her arm through Pearl's. "Come see the main house first," she suggested. "Isaiah's been working himself to the bone getting it ready for your visit." The cabin proved larger than it had appeared from a distance. A spacious main room served as both kitchen and living area, with a massive stone fireplace dominating one wall. Two doors led off to what Eliza explained were bedrooms, and a ladder provided access to a loft above. "Isaiah's been adding to it ever since he decided to court you," Eliza confided, her tone warm with approval. "The second bedroom was just a storage area before. And look here." She indicated bookshelves built into the wall beside the fireplace. "Said you were fond of reading." Pearl was touched by these tangible signs of Isaiah's consideration, his integration of her preferences into his home even before knowing whether she would ever share it. She wrote on her slate, "He's very thoughtful," Eliza nodded. "That he is. Caroline's passing hit him hard. Didn't think he'd ever look at another woman. Then he came back from Lincoln in May with your name on his lips, and I knew something had changed." She patted Pearl's hand. "It's good to see him hopeful again." Before Pearl could respond, Isaiah returned, slightly breathless. "Martha and Edward just arrived. They're at the foreman's house getting settled." The reunification with Martha was emotional for Pearl. Her cousin embraced her tightly, tears in her eyes. "Look at you," Martha exclaimed, holding Pearl at arm's length. "You're blooming." Edward, Martha's husband of 6 years, shook Isaiah's hand warmly. "Fine place you have here, Eaton. Martha's been talking of nothing else since we received your invitation." The rest of the day passed in a pleasant whirl of activity. Isaiah gave them a tour of the ranch, proudly showing off his prize bulls, the new foals in the horse pasture, and the improvements he'd made to the irrigation system. Pearl observed everything with interest, noting the respect the ranch hands showed Isaiah and the easy way he interacted with them. Supper that evening was a festive affair, with Eliza producing a feast that lived up to Isaiah's praise. Conversation flowed easily, with Martha filling the silence that might have been awkward with cheerful updates on mutual acquaintances and family news. Pearl used her slate when necessary, but found that in this accepting circle, her silence felt less like a barrier than usual. After the meal, as they sat enjoying coffee on the porch of the main house, Isaiah cleared his throat. "If you'll excuse us, I'd like to show Pearl the view from the ridge before it gets too dark." Martha exchanged a knowing glance with Eliza but merely said, "Don't be too long. The evenings get cool quickly out here." Isaiah offered Pearl his arm and led her along a well-worn path that climbed the gentle slope behind the house. Neither tried to communicate as they walked, content in shared silence. When they reached the top, Isaiah stopped and turned to face west, where the sun was setting in a spectacular display of orange and purple. "This is my favorite spot on the whole ranch," he said softly. "I come here to think, to remind myself why all the hard work is worth it." Pearl stood beside him, taking in the panoramic view of the ranch below and the vast prairie beyond. She could understand why he found it inspiring. "Pearl," Isaiah said, turning to face her, "I brought you here for a reason today." Pearl's heart quickened as she met his serious gaze. "When Caroline died, I thought that part of my life was over. I resigned myself to being alone, to pouring everything into building this ranch as a legacy for no one in particular." He took her hands in his touch gentle but firm. "Then I walked into that mercantile in Lincoln and saw a woman with the most expressive eyes I'd ever encountered, a woman being judged unfairly for her silence." Pearl felt tears welling up but blinked them back, not wanting to miss a word. "These past months have been the happiest I've known in years," Isaiah continued. "Your letters, your company, the way you listen not just with your ears but with your heart, all of it has reminded me what it means to truly connect with another person." He released one of her hands to reach into his pocket, withdrawing a small box. "I know we haven't known each other long by some standards. I know there would be challenges. But I also know with absolute certainty that I love you, Pearl Lawson." He opened the box to reveal a simple gold ring set with a small but perfect diamond. "I'm asking if you would consider becoming my wife, if you would help me turn this ranch into a home again, if you would allow me to cherish you for all the days we're granted together." Pearl's vision blurred with tears as she stared at the ring, at this good man offering her a future she had never dared to imagine for herself. For a moment, the weight of her silence pressed down on her, the inability to speak the words her heart was shouting. Then Isaiah smiled, that gentle smile she had come to love. "You don't need to say anything, Pearl. Your presence says everything. Just write your answer or nod or squeeze my hand, whatever feels right to you." In that moment, Pearl Lawson made her choice. She stepped forward, placed her hands on Isaiah's shoulders, rose on tiptoe and pressed her lips to his in her answer. Isaiah's arms came around her waist, holding her carefully, reverently. When they parted, his blue eyes shone with joy. "Is that a yes?" Pearl nodded emphatically, then reached for her slate which hung at her waist. She wrote quickly, "Yes, I love you too." Isaiah slipped the ring onto her finger, then kissed her again, more confidently this time. "We'll tell the others in the morning," he murmured against her hair. "Tonight, I just want to remember this moment, you and me, and this promise between us." They stood on the ridge until the first stars appeared, holding each other and watching night claim the prairie. No words were needed to express the happiness that filled them both. The wedding took place in November, after the harvest was complete, but before winter's full arrival. The ceremony was held in the Lincoln church, where they had first spotted each other across the pews, with Reverend Thomas officiating. Mrs. Abernathy closed the mercantile for the day to attend, and Mrs. Holloway wept openly throughout the service. Pearl wore a gown of ivory silk that Martha had helped her select, with lace at the collar and cuffs. Isaiah looked handsome and slightly uncomfortable in a new suit, his dark hair freshly trimmed, his face clean-shaven for the occasion. When it came time for Pearl to speak her vows, Reverend Thomas, who had been forewarned, simply asked, "Pearl Lawson, do you take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death do you part?" Pearl nodded solemnly, then, surprising everyone, placed her hand over her heart and bowed her head in a gesture so full of commitment that several guests dabbed at their eyes. "Then, by the power vested in me," Reverend Thomas concluded, "I pronounce you husband and wife. Isaiah, you may kiss your bride." The kiss was brief but tender, mindful of their audience yet unmistakably loving. As they turned to face their friends and family, Pearl's heart felt lighter than it had in years, buoyed by the love of the man beside her and the community that had accepted her despite her difference. The journey to Eaton's Crossing the next day was markedly different from Pearl's first visit. Now she traveled not as a guest, but as mistress of the ranch, the gold band on her finger catching the winter sunlight. Isaiah pointed out features of the landscape with renewed enthusiasm, speaking of spring plantings and summer projects as if eager to share his vision of their future. "I've been thinking," he said as they neared the ranch, "about expanding the main house before next winter. Adding proper stairs to replace the ladder to the loft, maybe another bedroom or two." He glanced at her, a question in his eyes. Pearl smiled and nodded, understanding his meaning. She wrote on her slate, "I would like that. A family needs room to grow." Isaiah's answering smile was radiant. "I was hoping you'd feel that way." Life at Eaton's Crossing settled into a rhythm that suited Pearl perfectly. She took over management of the household accounts, impressed Isaiah and Charlie with her head for numbers, and gradually introduced improvements to the main house that transformed it from a bachelor's cabin into a true home. Eliza taught her the particular challenges of ranch cooking, feeding hungry men after long days of work, preserving food for winter, making do with limited supplies when weather prevented trips to town. Pearl proved an apt pupil, her silent efficiency allowing her to accomplish more than seemed possible in a day. Isaiah, true to his word, began improvements to the house as soon as weather permitted. By summer's end, the loft had been converted into 2 proper bedrooms with dormer windows. A new kitchen wing had been added, and the porch had been extended to wrap around 2 sides of the house, perfect for watching sunsets, as Isaiah had once described to her. Their physical relationship had blossomed slowly, with Isaiah's patience allowing Pearl to overcome her initial shyness. In the privacy of their bedroom, she found that her silence was no barrier to expressing her feelings, and Isaiah proved adept at reading her nonverbal cues. "You speak volumes with your eyes, your touch," he told her one night as they lay together in the quiet darkness. "I've never felt more understood by anyone." When Pearl discovered she was with child the following spring, her first instinct was fear. How would she manage motherhood without a voice to soothe, to teach, to call out warnings? She wrote her concerns to Isaiah one evening after dinner, her hand trembling slightly. Isaiah read her words carefully, then knelt beside her chair. "Pearl, you will be an extraordinary mother because of who you are, not despite your silence. You listen in a way few people do. You notice everything. You communicate with such clarity without saying a word." He placed a gentle hand on her still, flat stomach. "This child will know love in every possible way, spoken and unspoken." His confidence bolstered her own, and as her body changed to accommodate their growing child, Pearl began to believe in her ability to mother effectively. She sewed baby clothes, prepared a nursery in one of the new upstairs rooms, and wrote long letters to Martha detailing her hopes and preparations. The winter of 1877 was particularly harsh in Nebraska, with blizzards isolating Eaton's Crossing for weeks at a time. Pearl, now heavy with child, found comfort in the snug house with its well-stocked pantry and the constant presence of Isaiah, who refused to leave the property even for essential supplies, delegating such tasks to Charlie instead. "My place is here with you," he insisted when she wrote suggesting he accompany Charlie to Lincoln. "I'm not missing a moment of this." Their son was born on a clear, cold February night, with Eliza serving as midwife and Isaiah pacing anxiously outside the bedroom door. After hours of labor that tested Pearl's endurance to its limits, the cry of a healthy infant filled the room, bringing Isaiah rushing in despite Eliza's protests that she wasn't finished. "A boy," Eliza announced, placing the swaddled infant in Pearl's arms. "Strong lungs on this one." Pearl looked down at her son's red, angry face and felt a love so overwhelming it seemed to expand her chest beyond its natural capacity. Isaiah sat carefully on the edge of the bed, his eyes wet with tears as he gazed at his wife and child. "He's perfect," he whispered, touching the baby's cheek with a gentle finger. "What shall we call him?" Pearl had been considering names for months. She reached for the slate she kept beside the bed and wrote, "James Isaiah Eaton." Isaiah's breath caught, "After my first son." Pearl nodded, adding, "To honor what came before, to connect past to future." Isaiah leaned forward to kiss her forehead, his gratitude beyond words. "James it is, then. Welcome to the world, James Isaiah Eaton." Young James proved to be a bridge between Pearl's silent world and the spoken one around her. As he grew from infant to toddler, he seemed to develop an intuitive understanding of his mother's nonverbal communication. By the age of 2, he could interpret her gestures and expressions as easily as his father's spoken instructions. More surprisingly, James became Pearl's voice in unexpected ways. "Mama says dinner ready," he would announce to Isaiah, though Pearl had written or said nothing aloud. When questioned, James would simply shrug. "Her eyes told me." The birth of their daughter, Emma, in 1879 completed their family circle, where James was intuitive and observant like his mother. Emma was verbal and expressive from her earliest days, babbling constantly as if determined to speak enough for both herself and Pearl. "Lord help us when she learns actual words," Isaiah laughed as 3-month-old Emma cooed and gurgled in his arms. "We'll never have a quiet moment again." Pearl smiled, contentment washing through her as she watched her husband with their daughter. Her slate lay nearby, but she found she needed it less often now. Isaiah and James had become so attuned to her expressions that words written or spoken were frequently superfluous. It was Emma, ironically, who eventually broke Pearl's silence, though not in the way anyone might have expected. The incident occurred in the summer of 1881, when James was 4 and Emma nearly 2. Pearl had taken the children to the creek that ran through their property, a favorite spot for cooling off on hot days. Isaiah was working with the cattle on the far side of the ranch, too distant to hear if trouble arose. Pearl was helping James build a small dam of stones when she looked up to check on Emma, only to find the toddler missing from the blanket where she had been playing. A flash of pink caught Pearl's eye. Emma's dress, as the child toddled dangerously close to the deeper part of the creek, drawn by the sparkling water. In that moment of pure terror, Pearl's throat opened, and a sound emerged, not a word, but a cry so primal and powerful that James froze in shock and Emma instinctively stopped moving. Pearl lunged forward, scooping Emma away from danger and clutching her tightly to her chest. "Mama?" James asked uncertainly, never having heard his mother make any sound before. Pearl stared at him, equally shocked by what had happened. She opened her mouth experimentally and found that her voice, rusty from years of disuse, was still there. "James," she whispered hoarsely, the single word burning her throat but filling her with wonder. That evening, when Isaiah returned from work, James burst out of the house to meet him. "Papa!" Mama made a noise. She said my name. Isaiah looked to Pearl, who stood in the doorway with Emma on her hip, confusion and hope mingling in his expression. "Pearl," she swallowed hard, then whispered, "Isaiah." The look of joy that transformed his face was worth every moment of the painful journey back to speech. That night, after the children were asleep, Pearl explained in halting whispers what had happened at the creek. "It was like something broke loose inside me," she said, each word carefully formed. "The fear for Emma was stronger than whatever was holding my voice captive." Isaiah held her close, stroking her hair. "You don't need to push yourself," he assured her. "Voice or no voice, you're perfect to me." But having rediscovered her voice, however weakly, Pearl found she wanted to reclaim this part of herself. Progress was slow, painfully so at times. Days would pass when no sound would come at all, her throat closing in response to some invisible trigger. Other days, she could manage short sentences, though never without discomfort. Dr. Matthews, summoned from Lincoln to examine her, could offer little medical insight. "The mind works in mysterious ways," he said after checking her vocal cords. "The trauma that silenced you was emotional, not physical. The same appears true of your partial recovery." Isaiah supported her efforts without pressure, celebrating each small victory and providing comfort during the inevitable setbacks. The children accepted their mother's inconsistent speech as simply another fact of life, with James often serving as translator when Pearl's voice failed her. By the spring of 1882, Pearl could reliably speak in short sentences, though she still carried her slate for days when speech proved elusive. The family had settled into a comfortable routine, the ranch was prospering, and the children were thriving. It was on a perfect May evening, 6 years after their first meeting in the Lincoln Mercantile, that Pearl and Isaiah sat together on their porch, watching the sunset while the children played in the yard. "You ever regret it?" Pearl asked softly, her voice stronger now though still gentle. "Taking a chance on a silent woman you barely knew." Isaiah took her hand, the gesture as natural as breathing after years of marriage. "Not for a single moment." He smiled, the lines at the corners of his eyes deepening. "I meant what I said that first day, though I didn't realize how true it was. Your presence has always said everything I needed to hear." Pearl leaned against his shoulder, contentment filling her as completely as the evening light filled the valley of Eaton's Crossing. "Thank you," she whispered, "for seeing me when I couldn't see myself." In the yard, James called to Emma, their laughter rising like music on the evening air. The ranch buildings glowed golden in the fading light, solid proof of dreams realized through patience and love. Pearl had once believed that silence was safer than speech, that withdrawal was preferable to risk. But Isaiah had shown her a different truth, that real safety lay not in isolation, but in being fully known and loved anyway. Whether in silence or in speech, their connection had transcended conventional understanding, building a language of the heart that needed no translation. As darkness settled over the prairie and stars emerged overhead, Pearl found perfect peace in the knowledge that some of life's most profound truths require no words at all, only presence, patience, and the courage to listen beyond speech to the silent language of the heart.